were rather spoilt, because I thought, well, I can just tell you all about how a BQP pig unit works, and that'll get me through my session. But obviously Richard's already covered it, and those of you who haven't heard it or seen it would it's online, it's available anyway. So what I thought I'd do was to look at some of the key areas of my work with LSB pigs, perhaps in a slightly broader look, and also the sort of stuff I'm doing with the wider outdoor pig industry. So, okay, this is all new territory to me, so hopefully it's going to let me go to a first slide. There we go, that's good. So this is obviously LSB Pigs, my employer. I've been a manager there for some considerable time. And the image you can hopefully all now see is, I've not chosen that picture because it's exceptional. I've chosen that picture because it's pretty much what anyone turning up on site or myself heading out for the morning to work would be faced with. It's a very typical image of the way the sows are housed, looked after, and the environment they're in. And the visual presentation of our units, or the units I manage, is something which is very important to me. I think having things looking right is certainly something I feel very strongly about, and an area that I work very hard at and spend a lot of time. It does take a lot of effort, and it is a job that's never ending, because, well, as you can imagine, not everything always goes in our favor. So yeah, that's how the place on the whole looks. And I think this is important because we are seen by so many passers-by. We get a lot of visitors come to the farm, and obviously the public are ultimately our customers. So I do rate it as a very important aspect of my work. I think good presentation hopefully demonstrates high standards, hopefully good welfare, and also a consideration for the environment that we work in, but also the local community that's around us as well. I think I think we owe it to everyone that when we're farming to farm very as responsibly as we can. And although a tidy farm doesn't necessarily mean that it's all being run necessarily to a high standard, I think if people drive past and they see something which is untidy, jumbled, little evidence of pride, and almost definitely that's not going to be as efficient or as well managed as it probably should be. So effectively, we're our own living advertisement board. We're visible to many people. All our fields have roads going past them. Up here in North Norfolk, we're quite a centre for tourism. So people come up from all over the country, visitors, see our outdoor pig units, and I'd like to think that their interpretation of our values is a positive one from what they see. And I know myself from conversations with people who buy outdoor bred products, and in some cases outdoor reared products. They do it because they see the pigs in the fields and they approve of what we do. And I think this is something that's very important from the point of view of preserving our livelihoods. So I can hopefully move on to my second slide. And at this point, don't panic, you haven't fallen into a National Sheep Association talk. It's just that when I look back at my farming life, if you like, the only picture I could find for the first 5 years was the one you can see now, which is actually in Western Australia, where I'm either demonstrating that I'm up for a challenge, or I just simply don't know what my limits are. But I think I'm 21 there, So yeah, that's my early years. And like I said, it was the only picture I could find, which I presume is because that long ago, we were taking probably 2 reels of film a year, and half of those didn't turn out. Whereas today, with mobile phones, we've got cameras on us all the time, and we probably take as many pictures in a week as we used to, or I do anyway, as we used to in a year. But anyway, a little bit. It has been suggested I should give you a little bit of my background and talk about what my career has been up to date. I promise I'll try and keep it brief. I'm from a non-farming family. In fact, I spent most of my childhood living in pretty much central Blackburn, so a very urban, towny, if you like, upbringing. However, my father was, I suppose, what you'd rightly call an agriculturalist. He did an agriculture degree at what was then Bangor University, now University of Wales, and for a short while worked for Ministry of Agriculture before doing teacher training, which led him into teaching rural science. So from a very young age, I had the opportunities rather of heading off with him during holidays to various field stations and teaching establishments where there were farm animals, goats, sheep, geese, poultry, turkeys, that sort of thing, bees, all sorts. So that's possibly where somebody with a with an urban upbringing got an interest in livestock. And as a schoolboy, as soon as I was old enough to be able to get off onto farms, either on holidays, or I was fortunate enough to have a grandmother who lived in the Lake District, so there were sheep and dairy up there. I grabbed every opportunity to get involved with the farms, and obviously developed a strong interest and desire to enter agriculture as a profession. I don't remember ever actually wanting to do anything else other than work in farming. So probably blame my father. Although, having said that, my very early school days, we were at that time living in a more rural area, and my first ever school report has a comment from my teacher who said that if Robert spent as much time and much attention looking at me as he does the cows out of the window, he would have progressed further this year. So possibly it was there from the very start. Anyway, moving on, I got to the end of school and I'd made a decision to head off into agricultural college. In those days, it was quite usual to do 2 years pre-college experience before heading to college. And I found placements. First year I spent with a small family-owned breeder, sow breeding, indoor intensive breeding unit, which I spent a year with them. And then the second year I did with dairy on a Holstein dairy unit. At 18, at the end of that time, I was 18 years old, headed off to college, and I enjoyed the pigs, but obviously the intensive side of it, maybe in those days I wasn't quite as aware of the perceptions of animal welfare and that sort of thing. But met some guys at college, fellow students at college, who had come up from the Thames Valley area, and they started talking to me about outdoor pigs, and I quite liked the sound of that. And I thought, well, it gives me the pig side of things, which I enjoyed, but also gets me out possibly in more of a farming environment that my natural instinct would lead me to. So first placement in those days, it was a 3-year agricultural course, but the middle year was a sandwich year. So I got myself signed up with a placement on an outdoor pig unit in Oxfordshire and headed off down there and thoroughly enjoyed it. So at the end of my college training, I got myself lined up with a stockman's job on an outdoor unit, again in Oxfordshire. That was a PIC multiplication unit, the Pig Improvement Company. But before starting that job, I headed off to Australia, and that's where the picture you can see was taken. getting a bit of experience and doing a bit of travel before settling down. So I worked with the PIC modification unit for about 3 years, and then being ambitious, took a career move, came up to Norfolk and started a brand new outdoor breeding unit on the Holcombe estate. That was a breeding company that was in existence then called the MPD. Spent 3 years with them, and at the end of that 3 years, I made another move to LSB. So that was 27 years ago, and they've been stuck with me ever since. And here's the team at LSB. There's been a few changes of face. I think there's 3 of the guys there on the trailer who aren't with us anymore. They're not all stock people. We've got the secretary on there, we've got the employer on there, and an extra chap who came in just to help us during a peak time. So we're normally running on a stockman level of about 8. But a little bit of background to LSB pigs. We're a BQP contractor, same as Richard, and we're a breeding farm, obviously. We're on 2 sites. That's mainly because when we last made a decision to expand the herd, we didn't have enough land available in one block. Our landlord had some suitable pig land a little bit further away, which it's a compromise. Effectively, it is 2 herds, but they're sister units in such an extent that health status is shared, staff are shared to a certain extent, and recording and finance, running of the business is really, we do really treat it as one unit in many ways. Just quickly going through the BQP setup. For those of you who don't know, BQP are a big group connected to pilgrims. Got some large contracts with retailers in the UK, and they own the sows. They also provide all the feeds and the veterinary medicines and the artificial insemination genetics and the equipment needed to perform that. They provide us with most of the stock task consumables, things like rings, tags, spray markers, and that type of thing. And they also provide the veterinary support and the field person support. They take responsibility for dead stock disposal and for livestock haulage off the unit. And they do also own some of the specialist equipment that's mostly related to feeding of the sows. Obviously, they're paying for the feed. And about 10 years ago, we stopped putting food directly onto the ground, started putting it into either farrow feeders when the sows are lactating, or into long troughs when they're in group housing. And the main reason for that was cost saving, but also had an environmental factor as well. But BQP took on the large expense of providing all their, we're one of about 30 units, so it is a big operation. They took on the responsibility for providing that equipment. So my employer, LSB, their part of the deal is we provide all the ARPs, the tents that we use in the centres of our radials for performing the artificial insemination in. They're responsible, or we provide the water tanks, gates, temporary fencing, water pipe, and all that sort of thing. Tractors and trailers are owned by LSB, and they have we have the unenviable task of also providing labour, which is easier to say than it is to do in this day and age. And obviously the land as well. We rent the land from a large arable estate, and we're responsible. That has to have a water supply, so we're responsible for providing the water. This arrangement for LSB has operated consistently for the last 30 years plus. Our relationship with BQP goes back that far, even before I was here. The business has evolved greatly. during that time, but the fundamental principles of the contract have really remained the same. And that is that our role is to produce quality weaners on a high welfare outdoor system to comply with the required assurance scheme standards that BQP require of us. And in return for that, we get a long-term fixed price, which is paid per pig sold. And that's quite a luxury in this day and age to know what we're going to get paid for the pig, not just next week, but 6 months time and 12 months time. That allows us to budget well ahead. It allows us to invest in the business and to do so with a good level of confidence. A little bit about our breeding stock. The genetics are PIC. The sows are a commercial cross. It's a Dan-bred landrace female. It's been crossed with a white Jura boar, and that produces our commercial sows. They're highly prolific, very, very robust, ideal for an extensive outdoor system. Their temperament is excellent. They're easy to rebreed, and maternal instinct is strong. Milk production, again, is excellent. We're looking at average born lives of over 14.5. So obviously the maternal instinct and plentiful milk production is essential for those sort of numbers being born. And they'll continue to perform at those levels right up to 7th litter in many cases. So we do have quite a few sows on the unit who have in their lifetime produced in excess of 120 piglets born alive, which if I cast my mind back to my early days of pig production, we would have been nowhere near that. We do cull, obviously, for various reasons, and we start culling on the whole from the second parity. Decisions on culling would be made on factors such as born alive. Also, we get occurrence of lameness, which is if it's a level which is untreatable, they'd have to leave. And we also get a bit of genetic deformity in the backs of the sows sometimes, what we call a dip shoulder. But it is hereditary, and obviously it's not a trait that the processors want to see in the carcasses that are going to them. So if we get sows that are displaying signs of a serious dip shoulder, that is a reason for culling, and obviously failing to rebreed. So we get dropouts for that reason as well. But on the whole, the vast majority of our sows do make it through to 5th and 6th parity, and like I say, a few exceptional ones will quite happily have a 7th litter. After that level, after that stage, on the whole, things performance-wise do tend to tail off. So I'll move on, talk a little bit about our farrowing department. So far, I haven't mentioned herd size. That's really because, in my mind, the way we operate the unit, we're able to give good management and attention to individual animals in just the same way that you would be able to in a much smaller herd. I think it doesn't really matter if you've got 15 sows, or in our case, we've actually got 100 times more than that. We've got 1,500 sows, but we look after them as individuals. It's something that the scale doesn't really affect what we do as much as possibly looking from the outside you would imagine. The picture you can see now is one of our farrowing areas. There's probably about 100 arcs in that picture, maybe just over. That's actually a fraction. We've got 560 in total, with obviously not all occupied all the time. About a quarter of them are being cleaned up, turned around, prepared for the next sow to arrive in at any one time. But it still means that we've got about 420 sows suckling at times. and that can be as many as 5,500 piglets, which is pretty big numbers, but you get used to it. And so I suppose the question now is, well, how do we manage the sows? How do we cope with the numbers of farrowings that are taking place at any one time? And really, the secret to that is that each sow is farrowed individually. You can hopefully make out in that picture the fence lines. So there's a fence just in front of the sows in the centre, and then up the sides of her, and then there's another paddock behind her. So sort of halfway up the picture, there's a second fence line. She's got basically a place of her own. The paddock measures about 15 metres by 20 metres, which is plenty big enough for us to operate in. It gives her a decent amount of sort of roaming space, and also it gives us enough space to, you can see the old bed sites there in the picture. We do take the straw away, but you can always see a bit of a scar on the grass. And we turn them around as well. During the summer and winter, we have them facing opposite directions to improve the environment in the ark for the sow. But she gets her own space. It's the only time during the production system that she is individually housed. With the sows, they definitely get used to it. The gilts, obviously, first time in there, it's the first time in their lives they've ever been housed singly. That can be a little bit more challenging. They do take a little bit of extra care, as you can imagine. I'll just talk through a little bit about the paddock. So we use it, or what's in the paddock. The sow arrives there 7 to 10 days before she's due to farrow, and that gives her a bit of time to settle in, make it home. Gives us a bit of time to carry out a few essential stock tasks. We record her number, she's wormed, and just changed that. There's a feed ration change, so she's been on a dry sow ration up until this point, and then we put her onto a lactation ration. So there's a few things for her to get used to, and obviously she spends a bit of time exploring her new environment and building a nest in the hut. Huts have changed enormously in the last 10 years. For many years, we're using steel and timber constructed, single skin, very basic structures, really. About 10 years ago, plastic molded arks came onto the market, and initially we were the only, or we were the first anyway, the first significant investor in plastic arks. But we could see huge benefits in hygiene and longevity, and the ark designs have evolved a little bit. We're now, or considerably I should say, we're now fully insulated, double skin, so the hygiene is outstanding. The insulation gives us protection from the extremes, so keeps them warmer, especially the piglets, keeps them warmer in the winter, and in the summer keeps it cooler for the sow and the piglets. And the way our weather patterns are changing is something which I'm glad we started on this road 10 years ago, and we're not playing catch up now. Along with the plastic molded arks, they're made by a company called Contented Products. We also now have a round top fender, not quite so easy to see in the picture, but traditionally fenders were steel, flat top. They were quite aggressive for the sows to climb over, and always that risk of things like sharp edges appearing, as with the huts when they were made of metal as well. We've moved away from that. Water is provided. You can just see on the left-hand side of the picture there, we're not using an open water trough, cattle or sheep style trough. We're using a water tank with a nipple. That gives us a very clean and reliable water supply. The tanks give a lot of protection against the frost in the winter. Also, the traditional style of open water trough are very vulnerable to, they run out of water because it's frozen, the sow gets frustrated, causes a lot of damage. Whereas with the tank being elevated and all the workings are basically up inside it, so she has no access to, she can't pull the ball float off basically, which was always a big headache to us in the past. Alongside the water tank, the black water tank there, you can see what we call the farrow feeder. Like I said earlier, we used to just chuck food on the floor, and also we used to have the sows in groups as well, 6 or 7 sows together. A lot of food used to get wasted. Sometimes sows would eat more than their fair share. So individually farrowed with a farrow feeder means that we can feed that sow exactly what she wants. If she doesn't eat it all in one visit, she can go back to her hut, come back out later in the day, and the remainder of her daily ration is still there for her. They're pretty bird proof, so that removes that element, and it just gives us so much more control over feeding each sow individually. Whereas when we were doing it in groups, you could just never make sure that each sow was getting exactly what they wanted. And as a result of that, there's a feed saving, which is pretty important in current climate. The opposite corner to the feeder and tank, you can just about make out where her wallow is. A few years back, we wouldn't have been making wallows in our individual farrowing paddocks, and we'd have been relying on her using the arc to protect herself from the heat. But things have changed so much. We now dig a small individual wallow in every paddock, and when it got really hot, we were rather busy because there's an awful lot of little wallows to fill up. But it's essential, really. It's got to be done for the welfare of the animals. So that pretty much covers the farrowing area. I think I did mention we now do wean at 5 weeks of age, and our weaning weights they vary through the year, obviously, but average wise we're looking at about 9.2 kilos per piglet, and we're weaning over 12 piglets a sow, so there's a lot of weight of piglets coming out of each of the arcs. Right, I'll move on. I've no idea how I'm doing for time, so I better speed things up probably. About 4 years ago, we made a significant policy decision to start to experiment with getting our sows onto green cover of some sort. Most of the mixes we've used are grass-based, but we have experimented with a few other things over that time. We saw other people doing it. It looked great. Our landlord saw other people doing it. He said, "Why aren't you doing it?" And we said, "Well, if you want to come on board, let's have a go." And it's been hugely successful. I think initially I was thinking this grass cover was going to be great for sow welfare. It's obviously going to provide grazing. It's going to give contentment, gut fill, hopefully improve the ground conditions for the sows as well, and reduce obviously erosion in certain areas of certain paddocks. Did used to make life for the sows a bit difficult as well. But in addition to those things, we've also discovered that the sows are now a lot calmer. That could well be because they are eating grass, getting gut fill and contentment from that. But they're also a lot fitter because they're traveling around the paddock all day long, grazing, walking around, just nibbling at the grass. Previously, they would have trotted out their arcs, gone to the feed line, had a drink, headed back to the arcs, and really by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they put themselves to bed, and they've probably walked a quarter of the distance they now do. We drive past the unit now, even on some quite grim evenings, and the sows are still out and about right into the sort of late evening, just mooching around, enjoying the grass. There's also the environmental side of it as well, which has sort of become apparent to us as we've been doing it. We've reduced an awful lot of erosion. We've provided an awful lot of habitat. If you can imagine the field we're looking at there, was bare earth. Well, we'd have gone on to stubble basically, but the stubble would have lasted just a few weeks, and then we would have been on completely bare earth. There was nothing there at all. There was no mammals, there was no bird life, there was no insects, and now it's absolutely teeming. And obviously, the insects might sound a bit insignificant, but they're at the bottom of the food chain, and everything else works. Everything else sort of feeds from that and works up. So, but we're seeing also small mammals, small reptiles, and that sort of thing amongst the grass that just would never have been there. And it's also going right back to my opening comments about visual impact. It just makes the place look so different, being on grass compared to bare earth. There's also subsequent cropping benefits to our landlord. The soil health is greatly improved. There's an awful lot of worm. We've been doing trial work. We've got guys that come out and monitor it. They dig holes all over the place, and all they ever talk about is increases in organic matter and worm activity and things like that. And obviously, if we're giving the field back to the landlord in a better condition than previously, that's a feather in our cap, effectively, from the point of view of keeping our landlord happy. The sow, I was saying earlier about the sows wandering around the paddocks, constantly grazing. Well, that then means that they're also dunging pattern is spread throughout the entire area, whereas previously we used to get very obvious latrine areas established, which is obviously highly concentrated nitrogen and that sort of thing in hotspots in one place. Yeah, again, the grass cover gives us some major advantages, but one of the biggest challenges is keeping it, because it grows great during the summer. It's looking pretty good at the moment, but midwinter, when the ground gets a bit wetter, it's too cold for it to grow. There is a bit of a challenge there to maintain it. And what we've discovered really is obviously the grass mix is quite an important factor. We played around with various mixes over the years. Some are certainly much better than others. Stocking rate is key, but that's one that my employer is often reluctant to talk about, because obviously less sows per acre is an increasing cost of production. But it is a consideration. I suppose probably the best way I can manage that is just making sure that we fill paddocks evenly, rather than having overfilled paddocks and underfilled paddocks. Also, resting the grass whenever we can is a big advantage. The shape of the paddock plays a part in it as well. It's much easier to keep grass on rectangles, which, like the ones we're looking at here, compared to a radial where everything's effectively like slices of cake heading up to a hub in the center. The wear on the paddocks and those radials is far less consistent. And also where you position your arcs, you need to, especially on the radials, you need to make sure that your arcs are positioned so that the sows are utilizing as much of the paddock as possible. We used to put our arcs much nearer to the fence lines than we do now. We're now getting them as far back, as close to the hub as practical, really, just to make them use the space better. But one technique I have developed and is now being adopted elsewhere, you can see in this picture, and that's actually flipping an area of the paddock. What we do is we split the paddock into 3 sections. The middle section, hopefully you can make it out, but the middle section has the arcs in it, and the water tank there against the feed line or the fence line, and a wallow. And then to the left and right of the area with the arcs is the areas that get rested. So they get access to one side of it at one time. When that batch of sows head off into farrowing, a temporary fence line gets moved across to the other side of the arcs. The feed troughs get moved as well, which isn't a bad discipline, because that recycling them means that spilt feed and excessive wear from the sows around the feed troughs is distributed better, and the bit of the paddock which the sows have had access to is shut off and gets 9 weeks to recover. In the summer, the regrowth, the regeneration is phenomenal. In the winter time, in the early years, I wondered a few times whether it was worth it, but whenever I didn't bother to flip the paddock, I always regretted it, because I think even though they may not be getting much leaf growth on the surface, there's still a lot going on below ground in the winter. There's still root development going on, and at the end of the day, it just gives the elements time to break down the dung, give it a rest from having sows treading around on it, and just recover a little bit. So we do now religiously flip the dry sow paddocks every batch, regardless of the time of year. I made some notes here about the different seed mixes we've used, but it's perhaps something that if anyone's interested in, they could get in touch with me afterwards, because it's probably a bit heavy for me to start reading out grass varieties and that sort of thing. So moving on, artificial insemination, or AI, as we tend to call it for short. Again, referring to Richard's talk, I think he covered the AI system for our units very well in quite a lot of detail. So I just thought I'd give you a few thoughts on it. And that's one thing that's always occurred to me, is that when I talk to small scale producers, I always get the impression they don't make the most of it, and they possibly underestimate just how helpful it could be to them. Most people with small herds that I speak to tend to have a boar or two, and I always think, how on earth do they keep him working sufficiently, keep him active enough to keep him fertile? How do they manage to match size-wise with their sows and gilts if you've just got one or even possibly two, and they grow so quickly, even if it's a small boar. 1 month, 3 or 4 months later, he's not quite so big. So yeah, I just thought I'd mention tonight, in my mind, just how easy it is to do. It gives huge flexibility in terms of genetics, even on our scale. We serve with a meat line boar. He's a red Duroc semen. But if one of our customers, one of the retailers that we supply, wanted a speciality for, and they do, for the Christmas market, so we could serve a batch of sows with Gloucester Old Spot and produce them 1,000 Gloucester Old Spot cross pork pigs, and then the following fortnight, we serve every 2 weeks, following fortnight we could swap back to our normal production. You can literally turn something on and off as easily as that. It's extremely cost effective, especially when compared to keeping a boar, who, like I say, I feel are often underworked, but also potentially very easily overworked as well. Semen from the breeding companies, it's fresh, it's not frozen, so you don't get the complexities of looking after it in quite the same way you do with bull semen. It's stored at 17 degrees. The box you can see in the picture there with the grey top, that's actually quite a large one. They do come quite a bit smaller than that. You can plug into 12 volt or 24 volt. Just easy, pop it, gets delivered to you, pop it inside it, store it, and use it when it's needed. Obviously, you do need to plan a little bit your ordering, but sows tend to come on heat 5 days after weaning. So if you know who you're going to wean, then you know who potentially you need to serve the following week. It's got a 5 to 7 day shelf life as standard. I think there are options where the breeding companies can even extend that period. but in most cases a 5-day shelf life would be perfectly adequate. And if you don't have a boar on site, you can get a boar in a can. I've used it myself, well, not personally, but I've used it on the farm, spread around, and it's basically a pheromone spray. You'll get a standing heat from a sow, just as you would if she had a mature boar stood in front of her. And in terms of where we do it, you can see here we're doing it in purpose-built crates. Some people do them in pens, but the sows are quite happy to. They've got a boar stood in front of them, so they're quite happy just to trot in there, pop a chain behind them. The catheter goes in. It's literally a few minutes for the insemination to be performed, and then they're allowed out again, and they just mooch around outside, return to their paddock, find a boar behind a gate, chat to, whatever they wish to do. It's a very calm, relaxed process. But you could just as easily perform the insemination in a pen, a small pen, or even in a trailer. And I've even seen people doing it literally just on the hoof. I think if your sows are confident for you to be around them and be handled, then it's quite easy, even out in the paddocks, to put a catheter in and carry out an insemination. So it really isn't as difficult as I think some people possibly perceive. And I think probably the most important thing is that it's just all kept very relaxed and chilled out. And that's not just for the sows, that's the stockman as well. It just needs to be no sort of loud noises or aggressive behaviour from any means at all. Just sort of keep it calm, keep it easy. The catheters are single use, they're disposable, relatively cheap to get hold of, and also the advantages really of not having either any boars or so many boars is a reduction in damage. There's less risk to the sows and to staff, and you aren't faced with that problem of trying to match boars to sows in size, because it's not a problem. Gilt service by AI is entirely possible. It does take a little bit more planning. You would have to record heats and keep a record of when you expect a gilt to come on heat. Or alternatively, there's a product called Regimate and one called Verbigest, a couple of products. You basically top dress their feed and give it to them to synchronize their heats, basically. So once you withdraw the Verbigest, 5 days after, they'll come on heat just like just the way a weaned sow would. Just sort of for a bit of background, the crates there, you can see half the crates in the tent there. We can quite happily, or in the past, we quite happily put about 180 sows through, carried out the insemination in a very relaxed 4-hour morning. When everything's set up well, it really does run like clockwork. 2 serves, ideally within 24 hours of each other, are performed, and yeah, on the whole, it's very, very successful. So I've talked about the commercial sows. Also, we have running within our herd 200 purebred landrace, what we call GPs, so basically grandparents. So within the herd, there's these 200, they're single parity, so they come in as gilts. They produce our replacement breeding stock, and they'll stay with us until 6th parity, when the whole lot leave and a new intake arrives, and we start the process over again. They are much more difficult to manage, partly because they are purebred landrace. They're not as robust. They're far more susceptible to the extremes. Hard work for them in the summer, and they don't seem to cope quite so well with the winter either. And the result of that is we can struggle with poor conception, and we do end up with quite an erratic born alive at times. They lose a bit more condition in the farrowing area when they're lactating, because their appetite isn't as good, and that then we then have to attempt to get that weight back onto them before they then farrow again. We use ad-lib feeding quite a bit. You can just about see there's two white feeders there in the background. So they're basically able to eat as much as they like, but even in that situation, often they lag behind the commercial sows quite significantly. My target is to produce 70 replacement gilts every 4 weeks from the GPs. From those 70s, I would hope to probably have 60 that we can eventually use. We do end up doing a bit of second selection. Obviously, while the progeny are with their mothers are distinctly different to look at. We also tag them differently, so we know who's who. As soon as they're weaned and they're in with other piglets, obviously it's important that we know who they are. We don't get them mixed up. We don't keep the wrong gilts. So what we do is we stick a notch in their right ear at birth, and that's a definite method of making sure that we're keeping the correct genotypes. So obviously 5-week weaned, they head off into kennels with runs for the first 10 weeks. Towards the end of that time, they are introduced to, we've got a little module electric fence unit, a little frame where they discover the joys of electric fencing. Prepares them for the next move, which is out into a growing radial, which is basically what the ones we can see in the picture on are here. This is pre-ringing, pre-tagging, so they do root it up, and eventually all that grass disappeared. They grow on around the growing radial until they reach the stage where we classify them as a maiden gilt. At that point, they are tagged and rung, and they get the last of their vaccinations prior to joining the adult herd. Target service age is around the 240 days, which gives us a first litter, if all goes to plan, being born around about the gilt's first birthday. And hopefully, if that's successful, she then becomes part of our herd and stays with us for another 5 or 6 litters. It is the landrace, the purebred landrace outside, is an area which is raising concern because of our changes in climate. I think there are going to have to be some changes, possibly in the genetics of the gilts or even the production system that's used, because it's fine when we've had a new intake of grandparent gilts. There's plenty in the herd, but because dropouts are higher towards the end of their time with us, we start having problems with insufficient numbers in batches, and then we don't get enough replacement gilts being born. It also means they don't mix well. They don't mix at all. So we keep them separate from the commercial sows the whole time. Which when there's 20 in a paddock is great, but if we've lost a few from the batch towards the older parities, we suddenly find we've only got 10 or even less, but they still need a paddock. So they're occupying an entire paddock just for a relatively small number of gilts. I'm obviously trying to select 70 good quality replacement gilts from 10 sows worth of litters or piglets isn't possible. So it is something looking to the future that we are going to probably have to make some changes. And on the subject of the future, this is my last slide, so hopefully I haven't gone too far over. Just talk about a few of the things which are currently happening on farm and some things that we're planning to undertake in the coming months. We've got a couple of trials underway at the moment. We've got a sugar beet trial. Back in the early summer, we ensiled an ag bag, 60 tons of sugar beet pulp, and we're now feeding that to a batch of dry sows through a Keenan feed wagon, which is really designed for feeding cows, but seems to have adapted itself very well to delivering feed to pigs over the fence line and into their feed troughs. That's mixed with a cereal-based balancer. And really the idea is that we're utilising a byproduct from the sugar beet industry, reducing the amount of cereals required for an equivalent ration, and possibly, although they're obviously grazing grass anyway, but possibly there's some extra contentment and welfare benefits to the sows for having a lower density ration, a bit more in their bellies. We're also just embarking on a piglet water trial. With 5-week weaning, we're having to creep feed, and there's been a few questions asked about the provision of water for the piglets. So we're about to start doing some work on that topic. And the grass trials that we've been working on with various agencies, Rivers Trust, AHDB, people like that have been, Anglia Water have been helping us, and the seed provider. That's going to continue. That's a long-term project. We also work quite closely with Contented Products on the design and development of their moulded equipment. There is exciting developments in farrowing arcs on their way, which we're at the sort of front of, if you like, from the point of view of test and development. We've got a long trough as well, which again is a Contented Products product, a moulded one rather than a steel fabricated one, which is currently under evaluation. But also we're having to, we keep talking about climate and extreme temperatures tonight, or I do. It seems to be the hot topic at the moment. And this last summer did raise some questions in various areas of the farm. It's something we're going to have to look at, not just from the pig point of view, but also from the personnel point of view. So we're looking to set up some cooling systems in our AI tents for next summer. Hopefully going to use a water mister to bring the temperature down inside the tent while the sows are in there. Many years ago, we experimented with shades between in the paddocks for the sows to get under between the huts, and I think that's something we're probably going to have to revisit and look at again, because in the time that's gone by since we last attempted that, arcs have changed enormously. So we're now we can probably build off or between two arcs, very different arcs in use now than they were 15, 20 years ago. So and also the idea of creating a shade from the arc. So I suppose the best way of describing it is a prop, and the idea would be to elevate the arc on some form of a structure that, instead of making it a tunnel effect with the back door off in the summer, it would also almost become a canopy, and the sows would be able to access it from all four sides, and obviously greatly increased airflow. So really it would be using the arc, the existing arc, to create a bit more of a shade. So that's something we're going to be looking at. And then from a personal point of view, hopefully in the future I'm going to be able to continue engaging with the wider industry. I quite enjoy getting involved a little bit with promotional work with the retailers, and obviously also promoting what we do as much and as often as I can from a consumer point of view as well. I do a bit of writing, presentations. Tonight's been an interesting one, and also I love doing visits. There's nothing more I enjoy more than showing people around the farm, and it's a bit easier when it's there right in front of you, I think, than the way I've had to do it for you this evening. And pretty much finally, we have been talking with our local agricultural college, Eastern College in Norwich. They, for a few years, have perhaps not abandoned the pig industry, but the focus moved away from practical livestock training, and they're now talking about re-establishing an outdoor breeding unit, a small training unit on the farm, as a closer representation of what is genuinely being used on a commercial scale, and that's something which I think I'd enjoy greatly, and I think it's something which would be hugely worthwhile. And finally, I might even get time to visit some of the people that I've established links with around the world in places like Portugal, Canada, and who knows, possibly even Wales. If I find the time, it would be great to leave my own fields behind and go and have a poke around somebody else's. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Hope there's some questions, and I hope you've found it interesting.
That's great. Thank you so much for that, Rob. That was really interesting. Yeah, great to hear about the green cover as well and all the different things you're doing like that. So we do have a few questions for you. So one is, why did you stop floor feeding?
Okay, so initially it was to reduce wastage. BQP set up an experimental unit probably for maybe 20 years, at least 15 years ago, possibly 20 years ago. They called it the Eco Unit, and they looked at all sorts of things there, but one of the key things they looked at was the amount of feed that was getting lost into the ground, breaking down in the ground, so the sows weren't getting to eat it, and it was basically just polluting the soil, really. So that was the main reason to, yeah, but also it's an economic thing. We can't afford to be throwing pig food into mud and it not being utilised by the sows anymore.
Yes, especially at the moment.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, thank you. And then another question is, how much do you feed your sows during lactation?
Okay, so we work on a step-up regime. They tend to come into, if I start just before they farrow, we tend to flush them for the last 3 weeks prior to farrowing at a rate of about just under 4 kilos, probably 375. It does vary a little bit depending on the parity of the sow. But once she arrives in farrowing, we after the few days, we do tend to, I suppose, as she approaches the point of farrowing, we cut her back a little bit, because we don't want her full of food. And that's one thing I perhaps should have said earlier as well when I was talking about sow fitness on the grass paddocks. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that the fitter sow with a lot more green material going through her digestive system then farrows quicker and farrows more easily. Some of the farrowings are quite long, and obviously they get tired towards the end. So the better condition the sows are in, the easier that is for them. But yeah, once they farrowed, we basically just step up half a kilo a day. Occasionally we see a bit of a loss of appetite when we get to about 5-6 kilos, and we just hold them on that level for a few days. The farrow feeders are a very good indicator to us as to the sow's appetite and how much she's eating. If we go back later in the day and there's still some food there, then the next morning it's still in the feeder. We know whose it was, no other sow has access to it, so we know she hasn't eaten everything we've given her. The sow's feed is recorded very accurately in a file, so we know exactly what she's been given on every day. And really, yeah, I mean, in terms of maximum, some of the older sows will hit 12 kilos, but typically it's 9.5, 10 kilos is the maximum feed levels, and they're on that for the last 3.5 weeks of lactation.
That's great. And then following on from that, someone has asked, why is it that you don't ad-lib lactating sows, which I think you've sort of covered, but if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, I think, well, with the purebred landrace that we use as the grandparent herd, you probably could, because I don't think their appetite would ever, you know, they wouldn't get carried away and basically eat too much. But with the commercial sows, the majority of the herd, they're just too gutsy. They would just eat and eat and eat and eat, and they'd end up over conditioned. I don't think it would benefit the piglets. It would probably hinder rebreeding. And we're just trying to maintain body condition as even as possible throughout the entire cycle. We don't really want sows losing a lot of condition, having to put it back on, losing it again, putting it back on. So trying just to keep a sensible sort of condition for score on them as much as possible is our aim, really. So yeah, it's really just down to, if they're ad lib, they'd eat more than they're required, which again would be more costly and wasteful.
Lovely, thank you. And then Kyle is saying, fantastic talk, Rob, thank you very much. How did the hot weather affect the fertility in the herd and your weaning numbers?
We didn't really see much of an impact on fertility. Rebreeding, certainly within the commercial sows, rebreeding was just as successful as usual. I think we saw more of the GP, the grandparent sows, returning to heat because of the heat, because of the temperatures. Weaning weights did drop. I think probably mainly just because the sows aren't spending just as much time with the piglets as they are in the cooler months. So we probably lost about 0.75 to a kilo of weaning weight in those really hot months or really hot weeks.
Lovely, thank you. Pippa is asking which species are in the cover crops and what size are your dry sow paddocks?
Okay, the dry sow paddocks, we vary them a little bit because of the differences between certain fields, but typically they are about 50 meters by 80 meters in size. So we're at a stocking rate of 10 sows per acre, so that's sort of 24, 25 per hectare. And grass varieties. So we've had various mixes. We've done all sorts of things with some mixes with herbs in and that sort of thing, but the vast majority of the grass mixes are based on perennial ryegrass and creeping red fescue, and that's probably, in my mind, that's probably the most successful one. I think the creeping fescue is particularly useful at getting a dense sward established over time. It creeps into between the drill lines and thickens it up really well. But quite often we end up moving the pigs onto fields that our landlords had in stewardship, and so they've got a very popular fallow mix on them, and that's basically, it's Italian ryegrass with vetch, bird's foot trefoil and the red clover, and it's not as durable, it's not as hard wearing as the specialist pig mixes, and that's one of the reasons why I first started experimenting with the paddock flipping, just to allow us to make perhaps a slightly less favourable grass mix work for the pigs, because I think I did say, but I mean, you go to all that time and money, and the last thing you want is halfway through your time on the field it to have gone. You don't want to lose it. We may not have quite as much by the time we leave the field, but we want to retain as much of it as we possibly can.
Great, thank you for that. And just a couple more questions. Do you have advice on systems for managing land for high pig health and welfare, as well as for avoiding erosion for small herds or areas of land?
Okay, well, from the point of view of the herd health, it can't get much worse than North Norfolk for pigs at the moment, because every other field seems to have either a herd of finishing pigs or a breeding herd on it. And from that point of view, for us, I think our biggest risk, biosecurity and herd health, is birds flying from unit to unit, the seagulls and the crows especially. Getting our feed off the ground and cleared up well was one of the reasons, is to try and reduce bird flocks. We were plagued with bird flocks at one time, but it is something which is pretty much out of our control. There's obviously the risk of incoming stock, and our approach to that is we don't get that much. Obviously, we're pretty much a closed herd, but when the GPs are replaced biannually, we tend to put them in isolation initially. So they sit in separate paddocks in a slightly different part of the farm, away from the main herd, and it just gives us a little bit of time to make sure that they haven't brought anything with them. And I suppose finally also it's the human element, having control over your visitors, making sure you don't have any unwanted visitors, and anybody who you do invite onto the unit who comes to visit, just make sure that you've got a set of protocol laid down and that they follow it, whether it's pig-free days prior to arriving, visitor boots, those kinds of things. You know, it's something that we're becoming increasingly strict on, and probably is your sort of first line of defence, really. Erosion wise, well, obviously we've got water erosion and wind erosion. The grass cover has improved both those situations enormously. We used to, as early as late April, we used to start to struggle with dust blowing around the unit. Not nice for the pigs, and it's pretty awful for the staff as well. The grass cover at that time of year has pretty much eliminated that entirely. We're even managing to keep grass to a certain amount on a fair bit of our roadways as well. And water erosion, again, it's slowed down. We've now got sows on, we're using a field for dry sows that we previously used several years ago, and it eroded, had gullies into it that were nearly 4 feet deep. You couldn't drive across some of the paddocks in a tractor. It eroded so badly. I was out on that field today with some people dung sampling, and I was explaining it to them. And I said, well, yeah, 4 years ago we're on this field, and you couldn't have driven from here to there. And today there's no evidence whatsoever of any water erosion whatsoever. So by having the grass cover, it's effectively meaning that we can look at sites, we can look at fields that without it really wouldn't be viable. So yeah, hopefully that answers a little bit.
That's great. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Yeah, and great that it's made such a difference on your farm there. Just a couple of last questions. So from that slide, you seem to have good staff retention. How do you manage that?
Sorry, could you repeat that one? I was just playing around with my.
Well done.
I was getting rid of abuse.
So someone's asked, you seem to have really good staff retention from that slide that you showed. How is it that you've managed to hold on to your staff?
Right, okay. So I think obviously the working environment is very important. I think people appreciate being part of a team where the ethos mentality is forward thinking. We've been fortunate to have a bit of a media profile for various reasons through the award schemes and some of the trials work that we do. And I think people do like, definitely like to be linked and associated to a unit which is viewed as being successful. But also it's making sure people are looked after well. Production bonuses are paid. I think we're an understanding business when it comes to people's lives and a sort of work-life balance, if you like, and also just continually trying to make improvements. It's a physical job, it's a demanding job, and we've done a lot of things over the years in terms of mechanizing, feeding, straw handling, bedding up, automation, I suppose, which has made the job not easier, but probably less physical and a little bit more technical. So we've raised the profile, I guess, of the career to a certain extent.
Yeah, wonderful. And then last question is, how many staff do you have on an 800 cell unit?
So is that on 800?
Yes.
800. So it's going to depend a little bit. We basically got our herd split in a 550 and a 900, roughly 950. The 950 is the herd that has the multiplication going on it for our replacements, and that does create quite a bit of extra work. But the 550 is a very straightforward, it's all on one field, so there's minimal transport, minimal driving around. There's no gilt production there, and that's run by 2 men. If one of them's away on holiday, we do our very best to replace them, and most days of the week that is required. You occasionally get a quiet day when somebody could possibly do it on their own. So at 800, you're probably looking at 3.5 people on a well set up unit without any complications of breeding gilts.
Lovely. Gosh, yeah, it sounds very efficient. That's great. And then the participants are just saying thank you for your time and sharing your knowledge. Yes, which I would also like to echo.
You're welcome. You're very welcome.
That was really interesting. Really good. Yes, that's great. Well, thank you so much for your time this evening. It's really much appreciated.
That's fine. Yeah, I've enjoyed doing it. A
Good.
bit nervous at the beginning, but I think I settled in after a while.
No, that's great. Like an old hand, like you've been doing it for years. That's fantastic. Thank you. I appreciate that. Lovely. Well, I will say Nostar and good night to everyone. And thank you to everyone who attended. And thank you to Rob as well.